What do we have to gain from perspective? Much. Hello, I'm Amy Zawi with the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report, and you are invited to join me this week, November 24th, and next, December 1, for an exciting interview with writer and podcaster Dara Horn. Her generous allotment of time to speak with us is greatly appreciated. Dara is an established novelist and recently published her first nonfiction book called People Love Dead Jews. Dara's repertoire of work also includes essays and articles published in a variety of periodicals, and she comments on various events that affect the Jewish community and beyond. Dara is involved in many activities that advocate for education and combating antisemitism. She brings a spirit of life and passion for today's Jews in a world with an ancient hostility towards them and a high tolerance for dead Jews. You can find Dara's work collected on her website, darahorn.com. You can also find links to her podcast there called Adventures with Dead Jews. Dara has graciously given us a significant portion of her time so that we can learn from her insights, her perspective, her experience as a Jewish woman and a mother and a scholar. We have much to learn from her, and I encourage you to seek out her work for yourself. And now, here's Dara. Dara, thank you again for carving out some time to talk to us at the Jerusalem Connection, and I will be sharing your book and how to get it with our viewers specifically so they have access to this book and more of your writing. And everybody, I'm bringing you Dara, who I introduced her book to you all a few weeks ago, Adventures with Dead Jews, and I wanted to bring her on specifically to talk about her perspective of why she wrote the book and a little bit of insight into her perspective on anti-Semitism that's going on right now, historically, and what it means for the future, or however the conversation unfolds. Dara, thank you again, and welcome to the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report. And I would just love for you to share your wisdom, and you can go with it wherever you'd like to go, whatever you'd like to share with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm the author of a book called People Love Dead Jews. And if you find that title disturbing, you will be even more disturbed by what's inside the book than what's on the cover. Because yes, it's it is a disturbing journey. And to start with how I wrote this book, I mean, I want to begin by saying that I spent 20 years not writing this book. And what I mean by that is this is my 6th book. I've published 5 novels prior to publishing this book. All 5 of my novels are about Jewish culture, history, religion, beliefs. They all deal very deeply with things like Jewish theology. They're actual historical figures from Jewish history who I include in my novels. They're about the intertwining of contemporary and historical Jewish history, historical Jewish events. But what I do in my novels is I always sort of was pushing back against this idea that Jewish life was defined from the outside in. And this is something that's true for my academic work as well. I have a PhD in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. So this is I'm very steeped in this world of Jewish literature. Mm-hmm. And when I used to give public talks, I even would challenge my audiences and say to people, how many people here can name 3 concentration camps? And that's something a lot of readers can do. And I would then ask those same readers, how many people here can name 3 Yiddish writers? The majority, more than the majority, about 80% of the people who were killed in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. There's a famously literary culture. And I would ask this question, why do we care so much about how these people died if we are not at all interested in how these people lived? So I always was sort of pushing back against this idea of Jewish life being defined by either anti-Semitism now or anti-Semitism in history. I started thinking about this topic differently in 2018, which was really sort of the beginnings of thinking about writing this book. When Smithsonian Magazine contacted me and asked me to write an essay for them about Anne Frank. And I got this request, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, because I thought, wow, I really don't want to write an essay about Anne Frank. And, the logical thing would have been to turn this assignment down. but I'm a writer, I'm not a logical person. So I was instead sort of thinking like, well, this is interesting, why don't I want to do this? And I've often in my career as a writer, I've learned that often the uncomfortable moments are where the story is, because that's where things get interesting. Mm-hmm. So I just was thinking about like, why don't I want to do this project for Smithsonian? And then I remembered a news item that I had seen about something that had happened at the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam that same year in 2018. So for anyone who's not aware of this, the Anne Frank was a young teenage girl who kept a diary while she and her family and other persecuted Jews were hiding from Nazi persecution. They were hiding in these like tiny secret rooms in an office building in Amsterdam and Holland. They were then, discovered and arrested, taken to Auschwitz. All of them except for her father were eventually died and or murdered. And then he discovered her diary after her death and published it. This building where she and her family and these other persecuted Jews were hiding is now like this blockbuster museum where they get, before COVID at least, there were 2 million visitors a year. Mm-hmm. Very big deal, international museum, tourists from all over the world. There was a young Jewish man who worked at this museum, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. The yarmulke being this like small skull cap that religious Jewish men often wear. And they made him hide it under a baseball hat. And he appealed this decision to the board of the museum. And the board of the museum then deliberated for 4 months and finally decided that they would relent and let this young man wear his yarmulke to work. And I had read this news item and I just thought, 4 months is a really long time for the Anne Frank house to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. And I just sort of was looking online to find this story again, which I just, had remembered seeing. And in looking for it, I discovered a very similar news item from the same museum from the previous year, from 2017, when visitors had noticed something strange about the museum's audio guide display. As I said, it's this big international museum. They probably have 15 languages for their audio guide. And when you go to a museum like that and it has like English and it has a little British flag, and then it says Francais and it has a little French flag, until you get to Hebrew, no flag. No flag.
No Israeli national
Yes,
flag.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. No Israel. It just says Hebrew. You can get a Hebrew audio guide, but they were not going to display the Israeli flag.
The national flag.
Yeah. And I was looking at these news stories. I thought, these might be PR mishaps, but they're not mistakes, right? Like there's a pattern here. And, what it really is that, Jews are expected, living Jews are expected to erase their identities in order to participate in this public conversation or to have any kind of public respect, right? What the museum was basically saying was that, we're here to teach people about the Jews' humanity. The nice Jews, that is, right? The dead ones, not the ones who are doing, yucky things like living in Israel or practicing Judaism, right? Like that's
right.
That's
with their
right. So it was sort of like it was just so glaring. And I did write this piece for Smithsonian. And the first line of my piece, and it's now the first chapter of this book, the first line of my piece is, people love dead Jews. Living Jews, not so much.
Yeah. I thought that was very succinct and yet encapsulating of a huge idea, right? A huge concept.
Right. Well, and it's really two huge ideas, right? One is that Jews are required to erase their own identities in order to participate in this conversation. And the other is that, people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. Mm-hmm. Right. And it really has very little to do with anything having to do with certainly not with living Jews, and also often not even with like the content of Jewish culture or tradition. Mm-hmm. Right. Those things are erased. And it's that people tell the story that makes them feel better about themselves. And that's something else that I brought up in that same piece where, there's probably the most famous line from Anne Frank's diary is that line that she has where she says, "I still believe in spite of everything that people are truly good at heart." And, that's the line that we, it's like plastered on the wall of the museums, and it's like in, on the book jacket. And, we say that line, it inspires us, but by which we mean it flatters us. Right.
And, I found that line that you highlighted. I mean, I read the book, of course, in my school age years, and I went to the museum in 1990 when I was in college, and I was always troubled by that notion. And you were the one to put it in a way that, yeah, that's what I mean. Like, I'm troubled by it because, and as you mentioned in your book, what was it, a few weeks later, right? That the good, not so good at heart people came.
Right. Well, I mean, the reason, right. There's so like the reason this line flatters us is because, we think that it means that, this person who's this, victim of this genocide is somehow forgiving us from beyond the grave or something. But what it, of course, the real explanation for that line is much simpler, which is that Anne Frank wrote that line about being truly good, people being truly good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who weren't. Right, because it's only 3 weeks later that she's arrested and deported to Auschwitz, and she met people there who weren't truly good at heart, right? So as she had survived this, she would have had maybe something different to tell us. So this is sort of that's this sort of self-flattering thing. So so I did write this piece, and and I was sort of interested in the way this person's memory was exploited, really, right, to flatter people, right, and also to kind of erase a lot of these aspects of Jewish identity. So I wrote this piece, and then the piece came out in Smithsonian Magazine in 2018 in one of their fall issues, and it came out just a couple of days before the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Okay. And it was like within hours of that attack, the New York Times called me and asked, would I like to write an op-ed about this? And, I sort of, as I put it in the book, I became the go-to person for the emerging literary genre of synagogue shooting op-eds. Like, this wasn't a job I applied for. And then I sort of, I just noticed over the past several years, like all of my editors at mainstream publications, like what they wanted me to write about was dead Jews. And I sort of just saw this pattern where, and I also saw what I was expected to say in those situations. And I was expected to say something, sad and beautiful and inspiring that was going to flatter everybody involved, instead of, expressing how I really felt, which was really, enraged. And, that was sort of like an emotion that I was not allowed to have in this context. And that was something I wanted to really explore. And what I saw, and then I sort of, at that point, after, as I said, I avoided this topic for 20 years, which was difficult for me as a writer who deals with Jewish themes. It meant like avoiding a topic that, my readers and editors all kind of wanted me to write about all the time. I avoided it for so long, but then I just sort of thought, I'm going to dive into this and sort of unpack this role that Jews play in this like wider public imagination, which is really sort of something quite separate from like the actual content of Jewish tradition and the lives of living Jews.
And I think that that's so important. So when you were getting these calls from these editors to write the op-eds after the tragedies, I'm assuming after San Diego, they probably called you too.
Yes.
Were they receptive of the perspective you took on what you wrote for those, or did you get any pushback?
Well, so with the first one, the Pittsburgh attack, like I wasn't so far off from what they wanted to say, because like everyone else, I was looking for like the hopeful angle on this situation. So what I did was I wrote a piece where I talked about how different this was from, anti-Semitic attacks throughout Jewish history. And what was different about it was sort of the outpouring of love and support from the broader community, right? That was what was unusual about that. Unfortunately, in Jewish history, it's not that unusual to have people murdered because they were Jews. What was unusual was that you had within 48 hours of the Pittsburgh attack, you had these like mass vigils, you had, every, government person known to man show up and give a speech. And they had there's, this like just this huge outpouring of support. So, that was sort of what I highlighted in my piece, was like, this is what's different about this. The problem was, as these attacks started happening more, you saw less of that. And then what eventually happened was there was a point, and this is where I end the book, was with these attacks on the Hasidic community specifically. that happened just before the pandemic. And unfortunately, there have been more since then. I was, finishing this book just before the pandemic, at least that part of the book. And for those these newspapers did not call me to write a piece about it. And that I thought was sort of very telling. And what I then did was I looked through all of the news stories about those attacks. And what was really astonishing to see just laid out before me was that you almost couldn't find a news article about these attacks against this, Hasidic communities. These were like sort of very strictly, religious communities that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting the attack. I mean, and that was, I don't know how much detail I want to go into here, but
I gotta just let our readers, our viewers know. Okay, so the last chapter was 13 or 12, and it's titled "A Dead American Jews Part 3," and you lay this out with such precision, and our viewers will recognize this line of reasoning because we reported it on it in the Red Alert. That idea of and you do it brilliantly. And just everybody, you got to get this book if you just read the last chapter, because it's so contemporary and it encapsulates that idea of all of a sudden it's kind of the victim's fault, right?
Yes, exactly. So just to give some examples for your viewers. So one of the attacks I write about is this shooting in Jersey City. I live in New Jersey. It's actually fairly close to where I live. It's about 20 minutes from my house. This was at a kosher grocery store that was, part of this Hasidic community. And when I was reading the news reports about this, almost every news article said something about how these Hasidic Jews were gentrifying a minority neighborhood, right? Which is interesting for several reasons, right? Number one, these people were actually, these Hasidic Jews were actually fleeing gentrification. The reason they were in Jersey City is because they were priced out of Brooklyn, New York, right? That's why they were there. Number two, these are highly visible members of the world's most historically persecuted minority and the top hate crime target, according to the FBI. Like, these are not like, white hipsters or something, right? I mean, these are very, very visible minority people, these Hasidic Jews. And number three, like, is there this murderous rage against gentrification where people are, walking into, cool coffee shops with automatic weapons to, blow away white hipsters? Because like, I haven't seen that happen. Like, I really don't think gentrification is the problem here, right? And then you had a very similar narrative going on with another attack that I talk about in the book is an attack on the Hasidic community in Muncie, New York. So this is it's a town in upstate New York that has a very large Hasidic population. And in this case, it was somebody walked into a crowded Hanukkah party with a 4-foot machete and just started slashing people. I mean, it's like really, really, horrific attack. And, I would read these articles about that attack and they would say things like, well, just for context, there was this zoning battle between the Hasidic and non-Hasidic residents of this town, which, number one, factually irrelevant because, as it says in the same article, the perpetrator was actually from a town 45 minutes away. So he probably wasn't involved in the zoning disputes. Yeah. And number two, do we normally resolve municipal disputes with a machete? Because like, silly me, I left mine at home when for the last school board meeting, right? I mean, and what I thought was like, why are these articles doing this? And as you said, it's victim blaming, right? Like, these articles are sending a signal. And the signal they're sending is that these people deserve it. And,
and that's the same signal that it seems to be every generation. It's just, how can whatever's going on, the Jews always end up with the target, and it's the narrative of the day. Whether it was the 20s and 1920s and 30s and early 40s, or whether it's probably while you were writing this, you probably saw the reports on social media. I mean, obviously we would find them absurd, but people believe them, that COVID was started by the Israelis, right? So that they could make an anecdote. I mean, there's always just a way to blame. And it just, every generation seems to, this is what we find so scary, is the ability for the greater public to to accept it, right? To accept it. The public who's supposed to be so sophisticated and woke and educated and technologically advanced, and yet still falls into the same traps that occur every generation. And our goal is to expose them, right? We want to keep exposing them so people can recognize it and tell their children and tell their friends and their church members or their community members, no, that gentrification in what was that in that New Jersey story? Let's talk about that New Jersey story, or let's talk about whatever the issue of the day is. And I just loved the way you laid it out, and you laid it out. So I read it and I was like freaking out, because the same thing went through my mind when that church in Charleston, South Carolina, the Bible said, nobody said, well, those folks were, they were Black and there were tensions in the area and the community. You don't.
No.
We would, and I agree that.
Yes. But I was thinking this too, and I went through, one of the ones I looked at was
Orlando.
Another mass shooting in 2019 that was at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, that was like an anti-Latino shooting. It was like, I don't remember, the attacker was like, it was very explicitly an anti-Latino hate crime. And I went and looked through all those news stories, and I was like, are there stories here about how, there were tensions about bilingualism in schools, or, there had been this dispute about immigration? Like, no, of course not. Like, because that would be absurd.
Because this was a crime. This
because
is a crime
absurd. Yeah.
with a victim, or victims, plural. And the idea of the news media just putting something in context, well, then it's their context, right? Like
right.
You said,
it's the same, like if you say, like,
about the zoning thing.
Right. Like, like this woman was sexually assaulted, like, she was wearing provocative clothing.
Right. Well,
like,
yeah, that's something more people can relate to.
Right. Like, this is absurd, right? It was that kind of level of absurdity. But, as you say that this happens in every generation, what I noticed too was like how old these, these lies are, right? So like the thing, like the thing about the zoning battle and this Hasidic, versus non-Hasidic residents, and how, they had taken over the town council or the school board or whatever it was. I'm like, this is a very old anti-Semitic trope about like, the Jews are like manipulating power behind the scenes and, taking over this non-Jewish community, right? That's very, very old. Very similar to like, what we saw this past spring with the war in Israel and Gaza, when you started seeing these things like, the Israelis are killing innocent children, because they like to kill innocent children. This is like a medieval blood libel. Right. And that's actually something I write about in the book. You talked about like, that these sophisticated audiences believe this. That was always true. And the other example you gave about COVID, like, COVID was started by these. It's like, that was something that happened during the Black Death in the 1300s in Europe, right? Actually, I think Jews died in the Black Death disproportionately to their non-Jewish neighbors, not because of the disease, but because they were murdered by them, because they're like, the Jews caused this plague, they poisoned the wells, right? It's this like, people seek simple answers to complicated problems because it makes them feel like they have some kind of control. That's where this goes. And so what, one of the things that I give the example in the book too is about, we think of this as like, new media is spreading this. Well, that was also always true, because I have a chapter in the book about the Merchant of Venice, and just for context, I talk about blood libels in, Renaissance era Italy. And there was one example of a blood libel that was about, it was a Simon of Trent. So this was like a toddler who, it was like they planted this kid's body in some Jewish family's home and then accused the whole Jewish community of like, killing this child, and and then, of course, they executed all of the Jews in this town of Trent. And then the kid also, by the way, was canonized as a saint. I think only recently, the church revoked this. It was, took a few centuries, and then the Catholic Church finally revoked the child's sainthood. But what was interesting was that, and this surprised me in doing this research, is that, this particular blood libel, which was certainly not the first or the last, happened at a time when it was there was a lot of new media going on, meaning printing press was new. And I was very surprised to learn that like, it was like a ridiculous proportion of the books that were published in Italy, like in the first decade of the printing press, were about the Jews butchering and eating this child.
Wow.
Like,
wow.
And with like, like graphic, woodcut illustrations of this, which they call like a deep fake, right? And like, this is like, this was being published in new media, right? And this was like, it went viral.
Right. So it's like that.
This is like really old stuff, right? I mean, that's like what's so, really creepy about it is how old it is.
Exactly. And you brought up, I forgot which chapter it was, what number the chapter is, but you do the chapter about where you go to the town in, I think it's the chapter where you go to the town in China with the ice, that all the Russians came in. Anyway, so I don't remember the details of the story. I'll let everybody read it, but you make an interesting connection about how anti-Semitism in this period of Russian history, which I guess was the late 1800s, early 1900s, morphed into that anti-Zionism, right? So, okay, the Russian government agrees that the Jews can go to this town and cultivate it, and I guess they're putting the railroad in, and we'll give money for the culture and everything, but maybe I'm mixing up two chapters, but you make this connection between, okay, all you Jewish people, we're going to support you, and you can have your theaters and whatever, but it's like you can't be the Zionist Jews. You can't.
Yes. Okay. So two different things. They're actually, look, I mean, there's no end to this topic, unfortunately.
Yeah,
so there's
exactly.
You're actually those are two different chapters.
Okay, I mixed them up. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so one is about Harbin, this city in China that was built by Russian Jews. So maybe we'll put that aside, and we'll maybe if you want to
let's talk about. I mixed them up. I apologize.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, they're both there's Russians involved in both. So and then, but the other one is a chapter called Executed Jews, which is about I focus on a particular Soviet Yiddish actor who was.
Oh, that's right. You met the daughter in Israel.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I met his daughter in Israel, where she now lives. So this is about the the Soviet Union starting in with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. They had actually I want to back up a minute and sort of like how the way I lay it out in this chapter is. Yes. I talk about how there are sort of two forms of anti-Semitism that we can sort of trace through history. And from a Jewish perspective, I think of them, this is my formulation, this isn't like some ancient wisdom or anything, this is just me. I think of them as related to two Jewish holidays that celebrate triumphs over them. So, and those two holidays are Purim and Hanukkah. So Purim is the Jewish holiday based on the biblical book of Esther, and it's about the thwarting of an attempted genocide against the Jews in the Persian Empire. And so that sort of form of anti-Semitism is like very, very clear, right? Because it's like, big bad guy comes and says like, oh, Jews are weird and different, and we want to like, let's kill them all, right? Like super clear. Mm-hmm. So this is like the parallel to like, the Nazis, like, the sort of like super fundamentalist jihadi, like, like that kind of like unambiguous hatred, genocidal hatred kind of thing, right? That's, that's that sort of what I think of as Purim anti-Semitism.
Exactly.
There's like
very
zero
clear, and we
no,
connect it all the time that it's like the same strain goes right.
Yes, it's like eliminationist, right? It's eliminationist. It's not about like, ooh, how Jewish are you, or will you convert or not? Like, there's none of that. It's just like, let's just, ta-da, kill all the Jews, the end. Like, super easy to understand. The other type of anti-Semitism that I sort of trace through in the book is what I call Hanukkah anti-Semitism, based on the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. So for the context of that holiday is really, it's celebrating it's really celebrating Jewish national independence. Mm-hmm. But what the context is that there's this Hellenistic empire that takes over ancient Judea. And at first it's sort of this soft persuasion where it's like, all right, this Hellenistic empire takes over, like, we have this Greek religion, we have this Greek culture, and like, we're not making people participate in it, but like, you're our colony and now like you're part of this too. So here we are. And, and what is interesting about that is what you see in that context is the Jews sort of like are forced to participate in their own humiliation in order to be accepted in this society. They have to participate in their own self-erasure.
Mhm.
And the example I give from this, this is a historical example from the time of Hanukkah, is the Jews built a gymnasium in Jerusalem,
Mhm.
right? Which was basically like, for them to say to these Greek overlords, like, we can be a good vassal state, like here we are, like we can do this, fine. And they recruited teenage Jewish boys to be athletes to, perform in these Greek games. This was not just like athletics the way we think of it today. Like this isn't just like, oh, I'm in the NFL or something. This was like, in Greek culture, like athletics are tied up with the religion, right? Like it's like it's like very central to the culture. It's like the way of being a person who matters, right? So like if I said like you're not allowed to participate in these athletics, it would be like saying today like, oh, you can't have a social media account.
Okay.
Like it's something like that. Like it's like, what you need to do in order to like really participate in this culture and to matter, right? So these teenage Jewish athletes, and as you might recall from ever having been to an art museum, Greek athletics were played in the nude. And these teenage Jewish boys had their circumcisions reversed.
I don't even know how that's possible.
I don't even want to know how that happened. I don't know, and I don't want to know, but yeah, this happened. And at that point, this was not something that anyone was forcing them to do. This was like what they had to do in order to participate in this society, like to be cool or something, right? So that's sort of, but then what happens, of course, is that then it escalates, right? So then this regime, at first, it's like this soft persuasion where they do manage to persuade people to reverse their circumcisions, but then like eventually it becomes coercive, and then they pass laws forbidding different types of Jewish religious practice, and then they put to death anybody who doesn't comply. So I mean, this eventually, this.
So you didn't get put to death if you were Jewish. You just got put to death for doing Jewish things, like rituals or worship or festivals or feasts.
Right, like of course we don't hate Jews. We just want Jews to take Jewish civilization and flush it down the toilet in order for them to be okay with us. But we don't hate Jews.
Right. And that was the key. And you write about it so clearly, because I talk about this all the time on these video podcasts, that all these people on social media, whether it's celebrities or congressmen or women or whoever, even leaders of industry, will say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist.
Yes. Okay.
And then you break down, well, how come you can't just disconnect? If you take the Zion out of the Jew, that's their identity, right?
Yes. Well,
nation of Israel, but yes, the nation of Israel. Well,
okay. So this like goes back actually earlier, and this goes to the point in the book about this chapter I wrote about this Soviet Yiddish actor. This slogan was coined by the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So this and before the state of Israel, this is from the 1920s in the Soviet Union. They created in, I feel like I'm gonna get the details wrong about this. I think it's in 1921 or something. The Bolsheviks want to like spread their like ideology throughout like the Russian, what used to be the Russian Empire now has become the Soviet Union. Convince all the proletarian masses to get on their side, all this, right? So one of their tactics is they recruit they create what they call the Yevsektia, which are these Jewish sections of the Communist Party, and they're Jews are participating in this, right? So there are Jews who are working for the Bolsheviks, who are either recruited or voluntarily participating in this regime, and their job is to spread the Bolshevik message to the Jewish masses. And the way they do this is they basically the Bolsheviks at this point come up with this slogan that we are not anti-Semitic, we're only anti-Zionist. So this goes back to like I said, before the state of Israel, this goes back to like 1922 or something. And by the way, also it's the Soviet Union who then later spreads this ideology in to their client states in the Arab world.
Yes,
in the
yes.
second, that's, where that's sort of, they popularized that in the Arab and in the developing world in a lot of their client states during the Cold War. So we are not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist. So, and another thing, we're also not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-religious. So what this means, what this means is like, Jews are awesome as long as they're not, number one, practicing Judaism, because like, we're communists, we're anti-religious. Okay, fair enough. They're also anti every other religion. Okay, fine. I mean, not fine, but
no, I know. We get your point. They're
there,
equal opportunity,
Yeah, well, about the religion thing, yes, but then this quickly becomes not so equal opportunity, because then we're also anti-Zionist. So we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist, and what that means is that anybody who is speaking or reading or studying Hebrew is like immediately an enemy of the state. Anyone supporting Zionism is an immediate enemy of the state. I mean, and then these Jewish sections of the Communist Party go and shut down. These are Jews who go and shut down synagogues, rabbinical schools, but also like, things like sports clubs that were, a Zionist sports club, right? Because this was sort of, was a growing movement among Russian Jews. And also like, people studying Hebrew, like were secular people studying Hebrew. All of those things are shut down. And then, so what's interesting to me about this is that two things. Number one is that, of course, in the process of not being anti-Semitic and merely being anti-Zionist, the Soviet Union, of course, not just at this period, but over decades, managed to persecute, imprison, torture, and murder thousands and thousands of Jews while not being anti-Semitic and merely being anti-Zionist, right? But then the other piece is also, of course, it eats itself, because, this Jewish sections of the Communist Party, within 10 years, all of the Jews who are in these, who are on these committees are, as we say, purged. Because it turns out they were all Zionist spies who were trying to bring down the Soviet state. Spoiler, there was no Zionist plot to bring down the Soviet state, but whatever, who cares? Those people all go and are sent to die in gulags. So, and that's, the same thing in the story I trace in the book about the Yiddish theater in the Soviet Union, right? I mean, the Soviet Union paid for a state Yiddish theater, right? I mean, they state-sponsored Yiddish theater, they state-sponsored Yiddish schools. There were Yiddish publishing houses that were, paid for by the Soviets. There were Yiddish literary critics who were salaried by the Soviet government. But, so all this sounds very wonderful for the Jewish community, except that like, it's this edited version of Jewish identity where like, you can be Jewish as long as you're not practicing the religion, not supporting Zionism, not speaking Hebrew, not studying traditional Jewish texts, right? So it's like, what's left is like Yiddish, but the problem is like, Yiddish speaking culture also is tied into a lot of those things. So then it's like, we got to edit that too. We got to find some play that we can put on in our theater that, doesn't engage in any of these themes. And, so then it just becomes this absurdity, right? Where it's just a completely denatured version. And this Jewish identity that's edited from the outside in. And of course, what's interesting is in the book, I interviewed the daughter of one of these Soviet Yiddish actors who was in this theater and was like one of the leading stars of this theater. And that, of course, turned out to be a Zionist spy, meaning Stalin decided that he didn't need these people anymore and just executed them all. I spoke with his daughter in Israel, and, she said that to me, that she almost felt like the Soviet Union was in some ways worse than Nazi Germany. Obviously not worse in terms of these atrocities against the Jews, but she said, it lasted so much longer. And she said they forced Jews to participate in their own humiliation.
Wow.
Right? They forced Jews to erase themselves. And then the other piece is, as she said, they never had a Nuremberg.
Yeah, there was
right? They were never accountable for what they did. Yeah. So, but she said that they did this damage over 3 generations of Soviet Jews, where these people were really forced to participate in their own humiliation. And it's the same story of that sort of this outside larger non-Jewish society deciding what they feel is okay for the Jews to be, right? Which is like the same thing you see in the Anne Frank Museum, and there are ways we see it, of course, in the United States as well, right? Hasidim are gentrifying a minority neighborhood.
Yeah. And
the conversation is not over. Please join us next week, December 1, for part 2 of our time with Dara Horn. Shavua Tov, and have a great week.